Welcome to Behind the Pages. Peter Rush is with us today to talk about his new novel, which is called Wild World. This is a novel set in the early 1970s amidst the anti-Vietnam War protests, and it centers around a student who is just learning about the shooting of some college students at Kent State University. And the novel goes on from there to look at the ways in which this affects a student who wasn't on that campus, but it profoundly affects the decisions he makes in his life. Peter has a master's degree in creative writing. He runs an international consulting firm, and this is his first novel. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you, Diane.
I'd like to start by having you tell us a little bit more about your book. How does it open, and who are your characters?
Well, the book is set in 1970 when the country was deeply divided. We had protests in the street. We had a president who was loved by some and strongly disliked by others. So it wasn't about today, but it was set in a time that was fairly divisive. So the setting is Steve Logan is the protagonist, a young college student about to graduate and confronted with the horrors of Kent State Massacre. His girlfriend, Roxy Fisher, who is a pre-med student, and the two of them, this is first love for both of them, so it's a love story as well, are deeply committed to social change. So the story launches from Kent State having protesting and being challenged to do more than just protest.
So why, because like I said, he was nowhere near Kent State. So why does that make him feel afraid? Because he learns about it and he suddenly feels afraid. He needs to find Roxy to protect her. What's he afraid of?
Well, the whole idea, and it's pretty hard for people today to really think about it, of American troops being on college campus with live ammunition shooting down unarmed college children. It was a pretty scary time for them. And
yes, actually, we should explain for people who don't know about the Kent State massacres that this was. Do you want to just tell us?
Kent State was. There were anti-war demonstrations around the country based upon the invasion of Cambodia. So it was an expansion of the war. In Kent State, Ohio, which was not a hotbed of radicalism by any means, the National Guard was on the campus and fired at the students, unarmed students, killing a number of them, wounding more. Some of the students weren't even protesting, they were just going to class. And there was a vulnerability. Up to that point, many students who had been protesting the war, and obviously the war had been going on for many years, felt that peaceful assembly would be fine. Okay, but here it was taken to a whole nother level, and all of a sudden campuses around the whole country shut down.
So this happened in the days before social media. Does that mean that rumors didn't spread as fast, or what would you say in terms of because how quickly did they hear about it, and how much misinformation went out after that?
Well, there was, it made national news, so in that regard, the information came out. The interpretation of it was very different. But my book, Wild World, if you think of the song by Cat Stevens, "Oh Baby, It's a Wild World," one of the things that I pull through the book is music in that time was the social media. And all my chapters have a music that is contemporary to the time, and the music was, if you listen to the lyrics, you get some sense of what was going on at the time. But the issue is that generation, because the major media did not cover it, passed albums, talked about music, and music, why it still lives today, is many of it had amazing messages that still resonate.
Steve learned about the Kent State massacres, but he had already been protesting actively the war in Vietnam and the expansion and the escalation of the war. He mentions that his father, who was a World War II veteran, disapproved anyone that was protesting the war. How did Steve explain that to his dad or to anyone else that challenged this?
Well, the generational difference between the generation that fought in World War II and those in the Vietnam era was World War II was the righteous war. We knew why it started. The enemy was the bad guy. It was easy to find. Vietnam was one where nobody could really explain why we were there or what we were trying to accomplish. And even the government, by 1969, knew that the war could not be won with the release of the Pentagon Papers. So the discussion between the generations was sometimes a difficult one because the older generation just went ahead and did it. Right. The younger generation, my generation, questioned why. And so Steve was brought into a lot of this with Roxy. She was much more politically active than he was possibly. But then his confrontation, maybe I'm getting ahead of why he made the decisions he made, was that he was not one who was just sitting back and protesting. You know, he felt strongly that you had to do something, you had to contribute, you had to help make a change.
And you know, there are a lot of parallels between what was going on then and what is happening now. But the one thing that's striking me as you're talking about this, the difference between Peter and his parents' generation, is that, at least to my mind, the political situation now isn't really across age lines. It's not a generational thing. It's really more a values, so you'll see just as many people in all age groups on one side or the other.
Well, I mean, while there was a huge generational gap, and obviously we just had Woodstock, which said that these people, that young generation could get together peacefully. There was also a divide based upon what part of the country you were in as well.
Yes.
And that wasn't generational as much.
Yes, yes. So prior to Kent State, I would say one of the things that Steve was thinking was that Americans were still the good guys. How did his thinking change after Kent State?
I'm not sure it wasn't so much who was good guys and bad guys. I mean, the issue when he meets with Sgt Dirk from the New York City Police Department. So maybe I'll get ahead with where the story goes.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I don't want to get ahead of your questioning.
Yeah.
But there's a teach-in at the university, and a Sgt Dirk, who actually was an Amherst graduate, was a real person, challenges the group of young people to do more than protest. That if you want change, you have to get involved in the system and you have to do something. And that provoked Steve and his discussion with Roxy of, well, we can't just sit here and, protest and then go back and do whatever we're doing. So that's what caused action. Obviously, there was a twist because this happens in Providence, Rhode Island, and Roxy is still in school, and Steve is graduating and doesn't particularly want to lose that relationship with Roxy. So he wants to stay in Providence, and all of a sudden, an opportunity comes up for him to join the Providence Police Department, which in fact is what he does. And that sets off the action in this book in a very different vein.
Yes, exactly, yes. How does Roxy's reaction to the shootings differ from Steve's?
I think Roxy was more outraged and probably more militant about it. She was throughout Roxy is, and one of the things you have to think about in time frame is this is the dawning of the women's liberation movement, and Roxy becomes even more feminist as the book goes on, and more strident about, well, not strident, more assertive about it, because in fact she is discovering herself as well. Again, time frame you have to think about: kids coming of age, 18 to 22. I mean, a time of change and tumult in your life. But Roxy is passionate about it. She's encouraging of Steve to do something.
Right.
She's not sure what she gets into, and that's how the book progresses.
Yeah.
But at the beginning, she's very supportive.
Yes. I would say, though, in her anger, she was a little less focused than him. He was sort of like, there's injustice, I have to do something concrete, where she didn't seem to have a focus.
Well, she was focused on the, quote, system, but the system is a big thing.
But that was kind of arbitrary.
Right.
Yeah.
Steve tries to get into, specifics. Now, what can I do?
What can I do? Yes. So the first thing that happens at Brown, once pretty much everyone has heard about what happened at Kent State, is that there's a demonstration right on the grounds of the campus, and so this is the first exposure we, the reader, have to how the police are reacting to the students demonstrating. What do they do?
Well, if again, to bring yourself back to that time, there's some pretty drawn lines, especially after what happened at the '68 Democratic Convention in Chicago. The police had, as I said, generational divide, but also the fact that they felt these people were un-American to demonstrate against the government, to protest against the government. So there was a very clear line about it. I actually use a snippet in there where some construction workers start harassing the marchers, which in fact I sort of stole. There was actually, that happened in New York City. There was a demonstration against the war about this time, and there was actually a riot from the other side from construction workers. So there was a divide, but the fact is there was open hostility from the police.
Yeah. Well, actually, sort of looking back on that time, I think I didn't realize it at the time, but there was also a divide amongst economic groups too, economic and people who were who had the opportunity to go to college, to as opposed to those who were working in trades. That there was a divide too, and a lot of those young men, anyway, women weren't subject to the draft at the time, but a lot of those young men ended up in Vietnam because they didn't really have the skill to know how to get out of the draft.
Well, that's one of the key elements that people don't recognize today. You used to live younger folks, is there was a draft.
Yeah.
I mean, there were ways out, but you didn't have options, and no matter what class you were. And we're also talking about a ferment time in terms of race relations, because we had the issue, the riots after the assassination of Martin Luther King, so that was still on edge. The Vietnam vets coming back, many of them were not enthused by what they saw in the war, and that led to another movement. So, as I say, there are multiple levels, very much complex society at the time, and the question, and I think I try to raise it throughout the book, is there wasn't a strong moral compass as to what was right or wrong.
Or there were different definitions for what's right and wrong.
Yes.
So let's talk a little bit more about Sgt Dirk, because this is a real pivotal meeting that both Roxy and Steve go to. So Steve listens to what Sgt Dirk has to say. If we could ask him at that moment why he chose to even, I mean, it was just a small poster that was on a wall someplace announcing that this talk was going to happen. If we could ask him what it was that drew him to that meeting, what would he tell us?
Probably it was a challenge as to what was going on in the system. Okay, I don't. After having seen the cops on the other side, here you now have a situation where you can talk to one in a small setting, one-on-one, and try to get some answers. And again, coming from a background where he didn't have that experience, it was an opportunity. But Dirk was, an intelligent, educated man who put a challenge in front of him. He said, you can't just, tune in, turn on, and drop out, which was the Timothy Leary saying for that generation. And that appealed to Steve.
Well, yes, it did. And it was a little surprising because in that time, Steve didn't choose a very popular path.
Well, as
The police were the other side, you know,
well,
they were the enemy for a while.
as part of as the book goes on,
Yeah.
I mean, that becomes one of the issues for Steve is he's not accepted by the police because he's a foreigner, he's a college graduate. Okay, he's not from Providence. He's better educated. And then he goes back to Roxy and his college friends, and you know they see him as perhaps part of the establishment, gone over to the dark side, and so he's caught in his own conundrum of who he is and where does he belong in society, and that's a driving force throughout the book, and obviously it's changing his relationship with his friends, it's changed his relationship with Roxy, which really is that dynamic and how that love evolves is an important portion of the book. But also his relationship with his fellow police officers, some who are very hostile to him and others who are just trying to tell him to just keep quiet, get along, and you'll be fine.
Right. But that's not his goal for being in the police force. It wasn't to have a career or to earn money. He wanted to be there to change things.
Well, obviously he wanted to earn some money, but
Well,
the issue
sure,
is that as he got in,
Yeah.
some of the moral objections, or I guess where he was coming from, said things could be done differently. I mean, one of the great things about, you know, I look back over the time period is, yes, things have changed a lot in policing. Policing was not as professional back then. Quite frankly, I've told people it was hit first and then asked what the problem was. You know, force was used indiscriminately. There was not much oversight, and it was a very different kind of an approach. And Providence, being a city that was not known for its good governance at the time, was a place that was a fair amount of corruption throughout the entire city, and the police department was no different. And that offended Steve fairly dramatically right from the beginning, because it's not something he had ever come across or I guess even imagined would be as pervasive.
I mean, he expected some of that. That was part of why he went in, right?
Well, he expected, it wasn't so much the corruption side. He expected on the brutality side, or had better policing and you know, better thought process, but the rampant, you know, look the other way type thing was sort of surprising to him.
Yeah. He makes the decision at a certain point in his head, anyway, to apply for, to apply for a position on the police force. But he doesn't tell Roxy right away. He avoids telling her, in fact, for quite a while, and I think till midway in the summer, even though he's made the decision prior to that. If she had told him, "I don't want you doing that. This doesn't feel right," it's them or me. What would he have decided at that point prior to joining the force?
He probably would have chose her.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, there
He
was
quite devoted to her.
Yeah. It was that first love and the intensity of that relationship. But he also had a very strong feeling, because again, he did get into law school. He would have had to go away. He didn't want that to happen. Roxy was a bit needy, okay, because of things that had happened in her life, and he didn't feel he could abandon her at that point. And so he was trying to find a way to stay in Providence as well, among other things.
Right.
So there are different dynamics there, but if he had to choose one or the other, I mean, clearly Roxy was where he would go. He decides at some point that he also needs to go talk to his father, because his father thinks that he's going to law school in September, and he already knows that he's not. He is pretty sure before he sees his father that his father is going to be somewhat dismayed and not agree with his decision. So what is he actually hoping for from that meeting? Well, I don't think he really didn't expect approval. He felt that he had an obligation to have the discussion, and he was trying to explain to his father that he was trying to do something bigger and better. That it wasn't just about trying to go out and make money, going to law school, be a lawyer, and make a lot of money. That there was an idealism behind what he was trying to do, and that he was hoping to get some respect for that.
What does he get instead?
Silence.
Yeah.
And basically, let me pick up the paper and read it. I don't want to hear anymore.
Yeah, so he basically gets a lack of engagement from his father, and I think that that's what he was, at least I saw that character as walking into that room saying, I want to engage my father in my life, even if he doesn't agree with what I'm doing. I want him to be engaged and involved, but he doesn't get that, does he?
No, and it's it was disapproval by not talking, which is sometimes the most difficult thing to deal with, as opposed to an active engagement.
Right.
And while they had disagreed over the politics about the war and politics about the running of the country and all those other things, this was really a life decision. And that disapproval, it stung. It stung Steve.
Yeah, yeah. Also, his father was clearly very depressed.
Well, and I didn't.
And pretty much, had given up on life himself.
Part of and I didn't want to get into too much of it, but there's a whole group of the World War II generation that probably never had PSTD diagnosed and went through their post-war activities, never talking about what they saw, what they did.
Yeah.
I know my father never did really. I dragged pieces out of it, but when you talk to a lot of them, it was just something that they had to do, and once it was over, they didn't want us to talk about it anymore.
Right.
But in some cases, it came back to haunt people.
Well, it did, and that diagnosis actually didn't even exist till well after the Vietnam War.
Right.
It didn't even exist in Vietnam, So unfortunately, a lot of people suffered without anyone around them understanding. Well, it's over. Why are you still unhappy?
What kind of trauma you see in that situation? It's pretty hard. So.
Yeah. So Steve does, get onto he gets through training or whatever you call that.
The academy. Police academy. It was difficult, but he got through it.
He gets through it because he's an athlete. He is somebody who went to college on a scholarship, and he played lacrosse, and so the physical challenges aren't that big of a deal for. He's well able to meet all of the physical challenges. And what would you say his biggest challenge was during the academy training?
Acceptance by the other recruits.
Yeah.
There is, I won't quite call it hazing, but let's say they specifically tried to challenge him, certainly on the physical side. It was also becoming familiar with stuff he knew nothing about, weapons training.
Yeah.
He'd never fired a weapon before. And trying to understand the tactics. The academic side, he did real well on the book learning portion of knowing the statutes and things like that.
Yeah.
But the street side of it, he was physical, he could take care of himself. But at the same time, there is a whole street smart side that a lot of the other recruits had, and then they knew the city, which he did not know.
Yes, right. But I was thinking about this too, about that character, that some other people might want to do good as a lawyer. You can provide social justice, through law or through other means, and he chose the police department, but that wasn't really that unfamiliar to him, was it? From where he came from, his background. I think he mentions at one point that most of the kids that he went to high school with were doing the same thing in other cities.
Well, he was, he was, working class, and so, he was able to accomplish going to an Ivy League through, academics and athletics. But, kids he grew up with were, that was a great job, getting a job in police or fire or things like that. So it wasn't that it was unusual to him or that he felt, above it. He was not a kid who was afraid to get his hands dirty or work hard. So that side of it wasn't that unusual for him. And I think, and it comes through in the book, is like he felt he should have closer relationships with one of these, some of these recruits, because he wasn't that much different than them.
Right, but they didn't see him that way. It was with the problem.
That's
that
correct.
They really saw him as Ivy League educated, better than them, and that made a difference.
Yeah.
He really wasn't one of them.
Yeah, why are you doing this?
Yeah,
type
yeah,
thing.
right, yes. So in the few minutes that we have left, I do want to sort of move away from the story itself a little bit and ask you, why did you want to write this particular story?
Well, the story had been in me for a long time. So, I'd been thinking about it over the years. And when I began writing, it was about 3 years ago. I did not expect it to be quite so timely or hit as many points as we're doing today. But I also thought that, the whole idea of just protesting without any action out of it is something that, really is a discussion point. And certainly for the younger generation, it's one that I think many of them, haven't really thought through. And that making change takes sacrifice. And a line that I've used is one of the things Steve found, that making a difference made him different. And so the issue is that, yeah, you have to give something up when you want to do something like that. So when I was writing the book, I thought it was a good story. It took some twists and turns as I pulled it together, and I really had to go back and learn my craft again. I'd studied it many years ago and had never really used it to this extent. So that was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
I do have a website, petersrush.com, so you can see even more. I have Q&As. One of the things about it is the music was extremely important to it, and I spent a fair amount of time listening to that music
I was just going to ask that, yes.
while I was writing, because it brought me back to the era and how music, depending upon when you heard it, will trigger different kinds of memories or different kinds of emotions. So there's a playlist. I have a Spotify playlist on my website if anybody wants to listen to it.
Steve is a Brown student and joins the police force. You were a Brown student and joined the police force. What are some of the similarities between you and Steve?
Oh, pure coincidence. The thing that I've said as a writer is that you have to write things from where you know it. And so yes, I did have firsthand experience, and I think it comes through pretty clearly in the book that I'm not just pulling things out of the air, and that creates a realism. The story is a good read. It's a fast read. It's a great love story, but it also has, I think it's captured the period, and it captured, that moral dilemma that many people have in terms of how are you going to move forward with your life? How are you going to try to live that right kind of life that you want? And Steve was trying to do that.
Yeah, and when you see corruption, what do you do about it? The Steve experiences firsthand watching cops on the take, police violence, abuse of power. Did any of those scenes come from your experience?
I won't tell you which ones.
Okay. How about just one scene?
Okay.
I think the first sort of major abuse of power that we see for Steve is the time is when he responds to a call. He and his partner respond to a call where there's noise in the building, and he goes in, and there's a large man who clearly has mental illness sitting on a couch with a hammer in his hand. Did that come from any experience that you knew of?
Yeah, parts of that had experience. I mean, one of the things, it comes through the book. And I think most policemen will say, domestic disturbances are always some of the most treacherous ones that you can go into, because you don't know what's going on, you don't know the dynamics. I have a scene where Steve and his partner go into one, and the partner actually makes it worse than trying to make it better. Which is again something that today's training, they try to lessen the tension as opposed to escalate the tension.
Yes, yes, they're trained for that. Yeah, and it's hard for Steve because he has to he has to make a decision on when he sees something that is clearly illegal. What does he then do about it? Especially when that corruption went right up to the top.
Well, you know, he tries to do some things around the edges, and finds that he gets reprimanded for that, for even bringing up the subject.
Yeah.
So he then has to find other ways to go around this, and you know, that's one of the things that drives the story towards the end in terms of, okay, now that he has been confronted with this, what is he going to do with it?
Yes.
And how does he approach it? And that involves finding out more about what's going on at the university, what's going on in the bigger picture of Providence, and not just in his little area as a street cop.
Yeah. So in what ways would you say you and Steve differ from each other?
He was much more heroic than me. Probably more likable, better looking. All those things that if you're a writer, you can make your characters anything you want them to be. I think, you know, trying to, you know, define a character from a period, and, you know, he has his flaws. I mean, he's probably not as introspective as he should be, and maybe overly devoted to Roxy, but.
Yeah. Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Unfortunately, we are out of time.
It's a real pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, we appreciate your being here. You have been watching Behind the Pages from the staff of 22 City View. I'm Diane Goshgarian. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane.